We make this very easy. With 1 or 2 engineers, it will take 2 to 3 weeks to set up the integration to our platform, and then you're done, right? That's also it. There's not much additional work after that. We see that those customers are really excited about it.
Hey everybody, James Shepard here. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Merchant Sales Podcast. Today I'm interviewing AW, who is one of the founders of a company called Silverflow. Also previously was working with Adyen, and so has a lot of insights into the industry in that way. And so they're looking to really innovate around the acquiring space. And it gets very, very tricky. There's a lot of ins and outs and a lot of things that I think our industry doesn't really understand very well. And it's the reason, frankly, that companies like Square and Stripe and Adyen and others have been very, very successful. And so AW kind of shines a light on that and talks about some of the things they're doing at Silverflow. It's, again, for those of you that really want to understand the payments industry and the ins and outs of it, this is the interview for you. Then Rich Norton's going to share some sales tips with us. And then Patti Murphy is going to talk about kind of the response from Visa and their CEO relative to the claim that they have a monopoly around debit routing. And this kind of also lends itself a bit to the Credit Card Competition Act and some of that. So really interesting insight just to see how they've reacted. And Patti and I get into a discussion about that. So if you want to learn about the payments industry, you're at the right place. You're listening to the right episode. Let's dive in. And don't forget, this episode is sponsored by Nativia. Nativia is a fantastic payment processing company. They also have banking services that you can sell and generate residuals on. If you want to learn more about Nativia, head over to nativia.com/CC SalesPro. Let's go. Hey, everybody. I'm joined here by AW. He's the co-founder and CEO of Silverflow. How are you doing today, AW?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me, James.
Thanks for being here. So we had a conversation recently, and it was very interesting because what Silverflow is really trying to do is disrupt the acquiring space. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit today and talk about some of the friction that we see in the U.S. market and what Silverflow is bringing to bear. But before we dive into that, I want to get your story. How did you end up in this industry, and tell us about your journey to what you're doing today at Silverflow?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. We'll try to keep it short. So I started my career at Bain & Company, the consulting firm here in Amsterdam, and actually also wandered off to the US. So I spent 6 months for them in Dallas, and there I helped some private equity companies look at early day payment companies. So sort of end of the 90s, early zeros, starting out
Right.
on e-commerce. And basically what Bain typically would do is helping with due diligence. Like a private equity company wants to buy someone, and we help to write the report to analyze the market, the growth potential, etc. After that, I wandered into private equity, but after a while, I wanted to have an intellectual challenge. I joined here in Amsterdam the team from Adyen. So that's really how I dove into payments. And actually, one of my first tasks there was, again, very US involved. So helping to set up the acquiring in the US for Adyen. Back then, this was based on sponsors. So banks like Wells Fargo and Deutsche Bank are typically who do that. And we set that up to get our own merchants on our own platform for our own acquiring in the US. And that sort of triggered us to think about other propositions as well. And basically what happened is now about 6 years ago, Robert Krauw, my co-founder, and I were putting together like what will be the next cool thing to do, what will be the next fun project. And we realized that the problem we had in the early Adyen days around acquiring was we knew a lot of the existing acquiring processors. So the systems which connect you as an acquirer to MasterCard and Visa and the other networks. So you have Worldline, Nexi, CI in Europe, Global Payments, FIS, Fiserv, Heartland, etc. in the US. There are probably like 25 or 30 in the world.
Right.
And they're all run well, they're run stable, but it's quite cumbersome to work with them. They don't have a lot of data, and they're not very quick on launching new innovation to the market. So we said, well, if we go with one of these legacy systems, we basically have the same product to sell as everybody else, and then you end up competing on price. Right. So we said, we don't want that. We want to be able to put a better product in the market. So the team at Adyen said, okay, let's go for it. We're going to build it ourselves. And this was really back in 2008. And well, I think that turned out well. Also, if you look at their stock price and market cap.
Right.
So what we said 6 years ago, hey, this situation, and that's 10 years after that decision was made at Adyen, nothing really have changed. You still have the same legacy platform players. We still sort of are steady, but still have the same problems. And if you want to become a new merchant acquirer or new payback, you can either go build it in-house, but that's a very heavy lift. There are some people do that, but it's not easy.
Right.
Or you can go with one of the legacy players. So we said, hey, we think there's space in the market to solve this by bringing a modern cloud-based platform, which is easy to use, which gives you all the data you need and want, and also who is on top of the latest innovation. And on innovation, we then mean things like network tokens, MasterCard Send, Visa Direct, recurring payments, 3DS, sort of click to pay, tap to phone, all the sort of newer features which need to be supported by the processors. But it can also be like very small things where you need to update a certain field to prevent data integrity fees. So it's big and small, but things change and you want to be on top of that.
So this is so interesting. So before we dive in, I want to ask a couple follow-ups to that. So can you clarify for our audience, what exactly does Silverflow do? Are you actually processing the payments, excuse me, or are you the technology stack that sits between, them and a different sponsor bank, or kind of help them understand, like, where are you in this like ecosystem?
Yeah, so we process the payments on behalf of the bank. So we basically are the bank's connection into the networks.
Okay.
And so this means, and maybe it's always easy to make, we do authentication if needed, network tokenization, the auth, clearing, reconciliation, and we also have a platform to help manage chargebacks. The only thing which we don't do, but it's very similar to the existing processes actually in the US now, we're not in the funds flow. So the funds will always land on the bank accounts of the sponsor bank, and then we help also to wire this to the merchants, but we don't sit on those funds. That's also not allowed in both in the US and not here in Europe either.
Right. And so then again, just to clarify further, because I understand this infrastructure, but some of the ISOs may not. So just to be really clear, if I'm an ISO, right, and I'm currently, I'm a Fiserv ISO, let's say, right?
Yes.
Am I now, if I want to work with you, am I now not putting my deals with Fiserv, I'm putting them with Silverflow, or are you just a tech stack that makes it easier for me to put them with Fiserv? You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, so Fiserv itself there will be a bank involved, a sponsor bank. So that actually works very similar. So we will replace the role of Fiserv or augment that, but you still need a sponsor bank.
Right.
And we have a couple of banks we already cooperate with. But if you have your favorite sponsor bank you want to work with, you can bring them as well.
Got it. Okay.
I think what the benefit of that is, because we're pretty good at working with different banks, you can sort of, it's always good to have more than one supplier, right? So
very much,
if you want to have one or two banks, maybe for different profiles or different situations, that's actually something we can help you with as well.
Got it. Okay. All right. So now that we got that cleared up, let's talk a little bit about the friction that you see and what you solve. So you touched on a couple things. You talked about innovation, adding new innovation to the market, but what about the existing market we see today for, let's say, ISOs and ISVs, which are kind of our two primary, audiences here. What are they facing? What are the frictions or challenges they're facing in the US market that Silverflow is trying to solve for them?
Yeah, so typically there are a couple of things, but for example, on the innovation side, what we see, if you as an ISV or an ISO, you have a new payment terminal, a new terminal model, and you want to introduce this, you have to go through what is called level 3 certification. So basically, there's an end-to-end certification process where you have to put test cards on your terminal, and you'll get from your processor, you'll get results, and this needs to be sent to the schemes. Typically, this takes 6-7 months with some of the existing processors, or maybe 3 or 4 if they're quick. We can solve this in a week. Not because there's now we do any magic, simply because we don't have all this overhead and project work and stuff to do. We basically tell people, look, send us your terminals. We'll take care of it for the rest. So that's, for example, if you have a new model or introduce something new or try something out. Of course, it's nice if you don't have to wait 7 months before to do this. And obviously, it's also a lot cheaper if it doesn't take 7 months.
Right. What about some of the things like, let's say, underwriting as an example? is there anything you're doing kind of the underwriting and onboarding process? I know there's a lot of friction there currently, other than obviously, for the payback model, not so much, but there's still a lot of friction there for the ISOs. Is that something that you guys have looked into as well?
Yeah, so we only participate in partly. So we're not underwriting merchants ourselves, and we also don't provide tools for that. So there are quite some nice tools in my, if you ask me, out there in the market. We are quite good in cooperating with those, sort of we can integrate into their flow. Um, but what we are very good at after you've onboarded those merchants in your books, so you've decided you did the KYC, you have the risk model identified. You want to create the MIDs, you want to create the MCC codes, you want to create DBA names. That is something which is very flexible in our system and also very fast. So we can actually create this instantly for you. And we're also very flexible in the type of structures you want to make. So think franchise models, think marketplaces or payfacs for iSaves with many sub-merchants. We're very, very flexible in supporting those. And these structures you implement will flow through all the way to reconciliation and payouts. So we keep this in our systems, not only on the accounts, but also the reporting and the payout instructions and the reconciliation details will carry these structures.
Got it. So I would assume that for the most part, the kind of partnerships you're looking for would be larger organizations, larger ISOs, larger processors, things of that nature. Is that accurate? And if so, like what like give us a little more context of that. Like what kind of company should talk to you guys?
Well, what we typically see what works well is people who are a bit tech savvy themselves. So if you have a couple of engineers in your team who are building API integrations directly, that's typically where people really love us because the burden on the technology is on them, and we make this very easy. We see that people have with one or two engineers, it will take 2 to 3 weeks to set up the integration to our platform, and then you're done, right? That's also it. There's not much additional work after that. So that's we see that those customers are really excited about it. Of course, if you have this outsourced or you're using another gateway, or you don't really use a lot of your own tech, this is less of an issue for you. But we're also happy to work with your partners or to talk with them and help them to integrate with us. It's not a blocker, but you see definitely sort of the customers who really get excited are a bit tech savvy themselves.
Right.
We don't care too much about the size. I mean, obviously, if you're very small, it doesn't make too much sense.
Right.
If you typically it's say over 100 million US dollars, then it really starts to make per year. Then it really starts to make sense.
Interesting. And so what's the economic model like as far as, if, because obviously we still have the sponsor bank involved. How do you guys make money?
Yeah, so we basically charge cents per transaction. Very
Got it.
simple.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one thing I didn't clarify that I should have clarified at the beginning was I talked about the gateway. You just mentioned it a second ago. Are you guys a gateway, or you connect the dots with gateways?
No, so we're really sort of on the back. We're not a gateway ourselves. We have some capabilities in that area, but most of our customers either have an in-house gateway or they partner with existing gateways.
Got it. Okay. So one of the questions that you've alluded to a minute ago about, partners who are a little bit tech savvy themselves, right? So I would assume, obviously, we already mentioned the APIs. I'm sure a lot of this is API driven. Do you have kind of the dashboard and, kind of to what extent do you have an experience that, the processor would be using, right? Versus just purely API where they're going to build their own dashboards and feed in your data. Like talk about that kind of, build versus buy kind of mix.
Yeah, so we are API first, but not API only. And so we try to make everything available over our APIs. And something I would love to highlight, we are, for example, very good on what is called interchange plus plus data. So what is the actual interchange paid on this transaction, but also what are the scheme fees you need to allocate to this transaction. And what we see there is that this is a complex situation where most people don't really know how this works, and means you either have some transactions where you're losing money because you're not billing enough, your pricing doesn't cover that, or you may be losing business, but because you're pricing too high because you don't really know what your costs are, right? The lesser your margin is, the better you have to know your costs. So we're very, very good at that. And this data is available over API, but you can also just look at it in our portal. where we have reports which you can download, but also you can look every transaction up, see what it costs. You can see what's the card holder type. Is it a gold card? Is it a platinum card? What's the issuing bank? What's the billing currency if it's an international card holder? So all this information is available over the API, but you can also look these things up in our portal.
Okay, so I thought one thing that might help to clarify what you guys do for our audience would be kind of a specific use case. So let's say that I'm an ISO. I've been pretty successful. Maybe I'm working again with like a Fiserv or Elevon or something like that. And I have my team of agents, right? And so we're boarding business. And we now want to start, branching out and getting ISV relationships, partnerships. This is very common. This is kind of what every ISO right now is basically trying to do. Well, of course, the first thing I'm going to realize in the US market is that all the legacy processors have a horrible system for this. So, the APIs are awful. I get this ISV and they're like, what is this? I'm used to integrating with, Stripe or Adyen or whatever, right? So how would you work with them? Give us some specifics of like, again, I'm the CEO of the ISO and I want to go after ISVs. Why do I need Silverflow? What exactly am I going to do with you? How am I going to structure this? And what advice would you give to kind of branch out my business to start making those software partnerships?
Yeah, so it depends a bit on the situation. So say the sort of more simple situation that you don't have a lot of tech assets yourself, as you don't own your own gateway, you don't own your own terminal fleet. What we can do, we can simply say, look, why don't you give an API key to the ISV? They can integrate to our sandbox, so very similar as they're already used to. And then sort of we can take part of that whole tech part, and you as an ISO can really focus on the customer relationship, on the service, on the merchant onboarding. So sort of the part of the work where you're really good at. And don't have to handle the questions around why does this doesn't work, where's my transaction, how does this chargeback work, etc., etc. And so we can definitely make that a lot easier for you. Yes.
It's so interesting to me. So basically, the hole that you guys are filling is really kind of that post sale, right? Because in other words, when you first talk to an ISV, the thing that they want to integrate with is going to be the gateway and the underwriting, right? Because they have to board a merchant account and then they have to process the transaction. So I guess to clarify, it's not like you guys are kind of like unifying that part of it. There's still that challenge of we need the gateway, we need the underwriting, we need that integration to happen outside of kind of what Silverflow does. Then after the transaction is boarded, you guys kind of become that post-sale dashboard, transaction level data, residual reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you're doing, right?
Yeah. So look, I wouldn't if you're an ISV and you're just dipping your toe into payments, I would say call Stripe or call Adyen or Move, right? So they are very good to get you up and running quickly. But after a while, if this is going good, you want to optimize. So you want to get our data into your merchant portal, right? Because it's not a great experience for the merchants if they have to go for data A into your portal and then for the payments data go to someone else's portal. Also on the underwriting part, you're already collecting a lot of data from your customers when you onboard them initially. So going through a separate system to do that is usually not a great experience. So we can really help you also with our knowledge how to do this, how to run this, and sort of how to make this from, say, the first MVP steps where you maybe have done this for half a year or a year and see that it's working. You say, okay, now I really want to grow this business. I want to make serious revenue and margins on this. How do I just sort of go do the next step? I think that's where it's very useful to call us and see how we can help.
Love it. So one other question for you. You mentioned the data several times. Talk about that a little bit more in terms of how do you see data and your use of data as a competitive advantage, as an innovation versus the way it's currently being handled in the US?
Well, I think one of the big things, and this depends a bit on the situation. In the e-commerce space, obviously the key thing is like conversion, right? Am I gonna have a successful transaction? You've been through the whole funnel, Google ads, people clicked on your ads, are on your website, filled their shopping cart, and then the transaction doesn't work. Well, that's super frustrating. Or even worse, the transaction didn't work, but you get a chargeback or it was fraudulent. So this whole game of off rates, chargebacks and fraud, you need to optimize that. And this is where this is why Stripe and Adyen are way more successful in this space than the legacy players. This is a different game than the card present space. You really need your tools, you need your network tokens, you need your fraud monitoring, you need your chargeback handling platform, and you need to close the loop on these things. So you need to feed your chargeback and your fraud data back into your risk systems to optimize them. You need to know when to apply 3DS, when to apply address verification service, when to apply network tokens, and how to make sure your conversion is optimized. And we really see that this can be multiple percent points, so say 3, 4, 5% higher off rates versus legacy systems if you do this the proper way. So that really is worth your time and effort to focus on this. And in the end, you do this a lot with data, right? You know why a transaction is declined. You can couple the chargeback data, the refund data, the fraud data back in all your systems and really optimize this.
Interesting. Yeah, very cool. So I do have one other question. So forgetting about all that for a minute, where do you see the payment space going? So I'm actually just kind of curious if you zoomed out right now. Obviously you spend a lot of time thinking strategically about the US market in particular. What is going to be different about the payment space in, let's say, 5 years, in your opinion, versus today? Or maybe another way to put that is, what are the big bets that you're making in terms of like trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, so we're betting obviously hard on the card rails, and so really see that in the future, despite all the say cryptocurrencies and open banking and other stuff around, that we don't really believe that card rails is going to go anywhere. There are globally about 6 billion Mastercard and Visa cards around. There are hundreds of millions of merchants. That network effect is not going away. So we think that plays a huge role. You see that some of the other functionality like Visa Direct and Mastercard Send, where you use that to push money to your cards, I think that's going to have a lot more use cases. So think about that. If it's at the end of the day, you're closing the restaurant, you immediately push the tips to the cards of your wait staff, so that they actually have that in their pocket, the digital pocket, immediately by the end of the day. We see a lot more on bill payment, on recurring payment. So what of course happens everywhere in the world, all these things are digitalizing more and more, and cards play a big role in that. I would see that things like open banking and could play a big role in P2P payments. This is very, here in the Netherlands, we have some very nice solutions for that, comparable to Venmo, but it is more open to everybody, where Venmo, you need to be part of the network.
Right.
And I could see on the cross-border that crypto would play a role for large, say, if I need to wire you 50,000 US dollars, right? These type of use cases. But I think a lot of the use cases which we see now and we will see in the future, that cards will be heavily involved, and this will more and more become common sense. It will become simpler with tap to phone. Tap to your own phone with things like click to pay, Pays. A lot of these type of solutions will make it even simpler. So I don't think we'll be typing in pounds anymore in a couple of years. But I think a lot of the payments will still go over card.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think ultimately, like you said, the network effect, it's such a big network that the issue is whenever somebody comes in and says they want to disrupt, right? Ultimately, it's like, well, if your disruption can find a way to also run over these same rails, your business is going to grow a lot faster. The idea of like creating a new network from scratch, definitely crypto has struggled to go mainstream because of that, I feel like.
Yeah, you see, like I think a lot. So we go a lot to events like ETA or Money 2020, and especially PIX in Brazil is now a hot topic. For example, here in Netherlands, we have a simpler system which is called Ideal. So it's a way to easily pay online. But keep in mind that these systems have got put on the ground when there was no good alternative. In Brazil, a lot of people don't have cards. They don't qualify for a card, even not for a debit card. So there was no alternative. When Ideal came in, and this is very similar story to the initial phases of Klarna in Sweden, your debit card in the Netherlands was not able to pay online. So there had to be an alternative. Similar to Klarna, a lot of the teenagers and kids in Sweden didn't have a way to pay online, so they started using Klarna. This didn't replace card rails. This felt another gap. And in the US,
Right.
that's because cards are so prevalent. I don't see that quickly happening. For some use cases, yes, peer to peer.
Right.
I would say mainly, but I don't see a master displacement going on
Yeah.
there. I don't think that will happen.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, it's been so interesting talking with you today. AW, give us the info on how people can learn more if they are interested and want to reach out and kind of see more of what you guys have. Where would you send them to learn more?
Well, like we have, they can have a look on our website, so www.silverflow.com. You can fill out the form there, or even just send me an email, aw at silverflow.com. We'll be at ETA Transact in Vegas in April,
Oh, great.
so people can come by our booth there as well. I think our booth is actually right across the ISV village, so
Oh,
that's
good.
easy for them to find us as well.
I'm sure that was intentional. Yes, that's great. Hey, well, AW, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your expertise. It's a very clear. I interview a lot of people, and I can always tell when people actually know what they're doing in the payments industry. You clearly do, and I really appreciate you taking time to share your expertise. And I wish you guys great success.
Well, thanks a lot for having us, and all the best to you too, and have a great holiday season.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Back here today with Rich Norton. How you doing today, Rich?
I am super fantastic. Great to talk with you.
Great to talk with you as well. So, Rich, we've been talking about sales tactics, and I have a really interesting question for you. So, one of the things I found is that when a salesperson is really struggling and they're not doing well, and I asked them a question that we talked about a few weeks ago, which is, what do you say when you walk in? Which seems like a pretty obvious question.
Yes.
I would say the vast majority of the time, it's not necessarily that they tell me something that I feel like is really bad that they're saying. It's that they have absolutely no idea what they're going to say. And
Yes.
and they'll kind of stutter and say, well, I usually say something like, well, I introduce myself and I say, hold on, I'm the merchant. You just walked in. Say what you would say exactly as you would say it. And they can't do it.
Yes.
And so I guess my question is, there's this balance, and I think there's a misconception that, well, if I memorize my lines or I prepare, I'm going to seem robotic or over prepared or something. And I think that can go really too far to where we have no idea. And then we're so focused on what we're saying or what we want or we're going to say that we aren't able to listen. So how do you approach this balance of really just preparing and knowing what you're going to say versus sounding robotic?
That's a great question. I think it's important that you do have a script when you first walk into the business, and then you rehearse it and you rehearse it and you rehearse it, and then you get it to fit your personality. Those that have watched me work in the field, they'll see that I pretty much say same thing when I walk in. I might change up a couple things depending on when I walk in. If I see a dog, I'll say, "Oh, is that the guard dog?" So I look for things to kind of throw them off a little bit. But I think it's important to know exactly what you're going to say, so you're not thinking about, oh, I hope I say the right thing, or what am I going to say? Because same thing, when I've asked representatives, let me hear what you say when you first walk in, because they don't know what they're going to say. It typically sounds like, and then they lose their eye contact and they lost their confidence. And because of that, they've lost the merchant. So it's important to be able to walk in and know exactly what you're going to say. And that's going to bring the confidence. So you're not thinking about it at all. And then how do you get that to come to a point where it doesn't sound robotic? You just got to practice it and then rehearse and go over it and record it. And then it comes to the point where it's just natural. And I tell everybody that if somebody was to ask you and they said, "Hey, James, tell me a little bit about what you do," well, you're not going to automatically go, "Well, I'm a representative so-and-so." You're not going to be going into pitch mode. You're going to
Right.
explain it with excitement. And that should be the same thing when you walk into the business. "Hey, I'm helping a bunch of businesses in the area. I'm the supervisor with so-and-so," and same thing. So it's important to know exactly what you're going to say and then just kind of fit it with your personality. So that's a great topic. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I had a situation, Rich, I've shared in videos a long time ago, been a while, but one time my wife, who is really into drama and performances and things, she convinced me to be in this play at our church for Christmas. And I had this, primary role in this play. So I had a lot of lines, and we were having these practices every week, and they just sounded awful. We were all reading our lines, at this table. And I was
Yes.
like, well, this is going to be terrible. Well, then Christina, my wife, says, all right, everybody, next week is the deadline. No lines. You can't hold your lines, right? So we all are scrambling to memorize all of our lines. And at that practice, I realized, oh, this actually sounds really good. And the reason is because we had finally memorized what we were going to say. We weren't thinking about that anymore. And we were now able to look at each other, play off of the emotions. And it really taught me that, there's this misconception that, well, if I memorize my lines, I'm going to sound robotic. No, if you don't memorize your lines, you're going to sound like an idiot.
That's right. Yeah.
And now if you read I'm not going to walk into a merchant with a piece of paper and read my lines. Obviously, that would be awful, but there is a level of preparation where, yeah, when you memorize those lines to the point that, okay, when I get this objection, I know what I'm going to say. Or, when I walk in, I know what I'm going to say. When I go to close, I have a bunch of different options. I have a lot of different closing questions, but I've memorized them. All of a sudden, you actually sound much more natural because you're not worried about what you're going to say. You're playing off of the emotions and the visual contact with the other person.
Agreed, 100%. And you make a great point. That's why I think role playing is a big part of it also,
Yes.
because when you give that awesome opener and they give you an objection or a question, rather than going, oh, I didn't cover that part, what do I say here? So
Right.
that's why it's important that whatever objection comes up, let's work on that. And you're going to keep improving. You're going to keep on getting better. But it's important to learn the lines and to get it down, because I've had people do that. It's like I'll teach them a line, teach them the opener, and then a month later, it's like, okay, let me hear what you're saying. And I'm like, where did you get that from? That's not even close to what we're teaching you. Well, I figured I'd try to do it this way. I'm like, well, how's that working for you? Well, not very good. Well, let's go back and learn the
Right.
lines and get this down. So yeah, great points.
Yeah, well, I think too, it's like you want to have a pattern of like, I know this works. So if somebody like copied, pretty much what you say, right? They wouldn't be able to deliver it in the same way, but they copied what you said, right? That's going to be a pattern of success. And then they might want to slowly iterate off of that. But when you just try
Yes,
to go and say, well, I think I'm going to do something just totally off the wall, you don't need to do that. There are many, many other representatives that are being successful. Just figure out what they're doing and then of course adapt it to your personality, etc. But like, right, you don't need to break the mold. Usually when you
exactly.
break the mold, you don't make any sales. So,
Yeah,
um,
don't reinvent the wheel. It works. Just go
exactly.
out there and learn it and do it.
Exactly. Well, Rich, for those who want to reach out and learn more about your team, the super crew there at Payrock, where would you send them to learn more?
Yeah, reach out to me at 904-434-4635, or you can email me at payrocrich.gmail.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rich.
Thank you very much.
Well, Visa's CEO Ryan McInerney is on the warpath, so to speak. He says the company is standing firm on its position in terms of the debit marketplace and the Justice Department assertion that it's created a monopoly in that market.
Right.
In a recent call with analysts to discuss Visa's fourth quarter and year-end results, McInerney asserted that DOJ simply doesn't understand how the business works and that Visa is prepared to fight the allegations vigorously.
Mm,
And I have to say, given the change in administration and how things are going to change in DOJ, I'm not so sure that this is going to go forward. I mean, it
yeah.
is there is clearly a misunderstanding here for those of us who do understand how the business works.
Yeah.
Um, DOJ filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, alleging that Visa illegally monopolizes debit network markets, using its dominance to thwart growth of existing competitors and preventing other companies from developing new and innovative alternatives. Now, the second half of that I can kind of take, but the first half, existing competitors, as we discussed in the past,
Mhm.
are debit networks, which are, two-way networks, not four-way networks, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and the other thing too that I think where Visa has a really strong case to be made here is that the payments industry right now really is ripe with innovation.
Yes,
Um, and yeah, sure, Visa is charging a toll.
right?
Um, but I think that the card brands have done an especially awful job of educating the public and the Congress on the fact that interchange fees and card brand fees are different
Are
things.
different. Yes, exactly.
And so,
Exactly.
the only thing that makes any sense in all of this is doing something to cap the interchange fees, which of course has already been done with the Durbin Amendment on debit.
And we saw what
Um,
happened.
and when we saw what happened, it really didn't do anything. And for the end user, and then credit, it's like, well, Sure. So I think if they, I'm not a big proponent of this regulation. I think it would stifle innovation and things of that nature. But I think
Right.
that, as you know, I'm a big proponent of some kind of transparency move where they require Visa to send the true interchange cost through at the moment of authorization and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I kind of feel like if, um, yeah, I mean, Congress is trying to make they're trying to make moves and the different states are making moves, but it's out of this lack of understanding that really on average, I think the numbers I've seen is that it's about 20 basis points of total kind of average cost for
Right.
card brand fees.
Right.
And nobody cares about that. What they care about is the 2% interchange.
Right. Which
And
blows
that's
my
not from
mind.
Visa.
Yeah.
It's from the issuing banks. So,
Right. Right.
it's just not gonna what they're talking about doing is just not gonna make a dent at all.
So, and they also talk in terms of quote processing fees, like Attorney General Merrick Garland, excuse me, he noted during a press conference that more than 60% of debit transactions run on Visa's network and generate over 7 billion in yearly processing fees. Well, that's processing fees. That's not just interchange fees,
Right.
you know. And he alleged that the other thing is that he's alleged that Visa has entered into a web of unlawful and anti-competitive agreements with merchants and banks to support that revenue flow. Now, there, I think he's talking about some of the deals that Visa has with some of the larger merchants,
Right.
you know. Um, it also contains the lawsuit also contains allegations that Visa exerts leverage based on the number of transactions that flow through the payment rails. But
Right.
then we all know that volume, it
Right.
reminds me of the old. I don't. You may not be old enough to remember the early Saturday Night Live skits where they'd go, "The Change National Bank. You give us a
Mm-mm.
dollar, we give you 100 pennies."
Right.
It's
Right.
all about change, you know.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
Yeah.
anyway, um, not surprisingly, retailers cheered the DOJ lawsuit. Stephanie March, general counsel at the National Retail Federation, um, alleged that these are just the tip of the iceberg. And NRF, of course, is one of many parties that has taken Visa and its competitor to court over uh, its structures and rules as well as its fees.
Right.
Like I said early on, though, I'm not sure that a lot of these lawsuits are going to go forward anytime soon. And especially when you consider, you know, some of these lawsuits involving the merchants have been going on longer than you've been in the business. No
Right.
offense, but I mean
Right.
20 plus years.
Yep.
I've been reporting on these things since the 1990s.
Right. Right.
And I just don't see it going anytime fast.
Yeah.
But it's worth taking a note of.
Yeah, it is. And again, I think the real big shift in the industry is going to happen, you know, when some kind of amendment gets tagged on to some kind of legislation. And I do think Visa and MasterCard are at risk for this because
Oh yeah.
after that hearing we talked about in recent
Mm-hmm.
episodes, I mean, there's definitely an appetite for regulation, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
among the Republicans, which now are taking over. So I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to see how it goes, but I could definitely see an amendment getting kind of
Tacked
tacked
on.
on to something where it's catastrophic for, but again, though, the thing I guess I don't understand is they or that Congress doesn't understand is they keep attacking Visa and MasterCard, and what they need to do is they need to, like the Durbin Amendment, regulated the banks.
Right.
You know what I mean? There was at least
Right.
an understanding of who they were trying to regulate. That understanding doesn't seem to exist yet on this issue. And I think that's frustrating. If they would figure that part of it out, well, then it would be like, okay, if you want to go after Visa, you need to sue Visa for, monopoly and antitrust
Right.
violations, right?
Right.
That's what that is. I mean, I'm not saying that they're guilty of that. I'm just saying
That's what the
that's
allegation should point to. If
right. The allegation should
Right.
point to the antitrust, case, not regulation. There's nothing to regulate, like
Right.
there, in my opinion. So, but then it's like if you're saying, well, we want to cap the cost of payment processing, well, then you got to regulate the issuing bank. So there's just a very significant disconnect in just terms of like what they're trying to do.
And I think there's a disconnect in the lobbying organizations, the banks and the electronic payments lobbying organizations. There needs to be more of a coordination. And I
Yes.
know I've spoken about this in the past, but back in 2002 or thereabouts, after the World Trade Center, fiasco and air traffic was stopped, that's how checks stopped being written, because the banking lobbies and the corporate lobbies got together, and the processing people got together and educated Congress. This is how checks are moved. This is why checks were not processed during that week.
Right.
All you have to do is make a few simple changes to the law,
Right.
and everything will be copacetic. And
Right.
it worked out. I mean, 20 years later, how many people write checks? I wrote a check today for the first time in months, because
Right.
it was a donation I was giving, and I didn't feel like putting my credit card number on a blank piece of paper,
Right. Exactly.
you
Yep.
know,
Yep.
and they didn't have the online option.
Right.
So, anyway,
Yeah.
but I do think that, if the people like the ABA and the ETA and the consumer bankers and the
Yeah.
state bank regulators got together
Right.
and educated Congress. I wasn't aware personally of how much education had gone into the Check 21 Act until last summer, when I was asked to
Hmm.
edit a book on it. And these
Yeah.
guys really had their act together in terms of
Yeah.
how they approach Congress.
Right. Right.
So
Well, maybe the card brands and the ETA can take a page out of that book and
maybe they should.
start
Yeah.
educating. So
Okay.
thank you, Patty. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing.